Hello everyone, checking those waveforms. How's it going today? It's Wednesday again. It's been rainy mostly all week. So if it is also rainy where you are, I hope you are either a fan of the rain, which then it's good for you, or not bothered by the rain very much. So there is that. It has been a pretty big week for me, lots of things going on. But I am excited to be here with you all and talk about shared world building during session 0, which is a topic that I really love. And when I was thinking about my prep for this and how to talk about the way that I approach it, the thing that seemed like the best idea was to talk some, but then try to spend a fair amount of the time today just actually doing the process of shared world building in session 0, or shared world building the way that I would often do it in session 0, right? Because I would need a specific group of players to actually do a shared world building during session 0 right now, right here. I recorded an actual play where I was GMing, where we did collaborative world building in session 0, but that is currently in editing, and so I don't have it to refer to. But when it is all done and edited, I'm definitely going to talk about it. There'll probably be a stream referring back to it more specifically, or I will talk about it more generally across a few different streams. So hello, Pathfinder PhD. Glad to hear that you love collaborative world building. My hope here is that some number of the folks that are watching live will be interested in participating in the process so that we can have a little bit more of a sense through example of what this type of collaborative world building might look like. Right? I'm going to interchange between collaborative and shared world building pretty interchangeably here because that's just how my brain works. So there's your caveat here. I am going to throw this up. I don't think we're actually going to refer to anything from the CGL or the SRD today, but I'm going to put this here just in case we need it, right? If I get to some point and then I realize that I need to go and jump, because that will make it easier on post-production. So we've also got this up here for that same reason. And that can go away for now, and then I'll bring it back if I feel like we're actually in the place where we need it. So that all said, now I think I'm going to talk a little bit at the high level, right? These are some of my principles of shared world building for TTRPGs. And if you have listened to the Cheers Not a Hag, Contribute to the Cult's Totem, I think is now officially like support for the Sharing Spotlight stream subseries, since that is what kind of unlocked it to begin with. I don't have anything else that I can put it to, so I'm just going to remind folks that the second Sharing Spotlight video is now up on YouTube. It is talking about Apocalypse Keys, which is a very cool paranormal mystery RPG by Ray Najati that I got to play in an actual play of and played in a one-shot of with Ray. That one-shot was probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, and then the actual play was last year. That was very fun. I like that game a lot. It has some pretty different vibes than a lot of Daggerheart games are going to have, but especially if you're interested in what's been happening in Powered by the Apocalypse design in the last few years, you might go check that out. So what I was going to say is, if you've already seen my video on building better background prompts and answering background prompts well and connecting characters through session 0 and like through weaving together their backstories, you're going to have already heard some of this, but I'm going to go ahead and repeat it as if people have not heard the other stuff, because some folks will not have watched that stream, and I don't want to necessarily start building a curriculum where it's like, you can't watch today's stream unless you've watched this one, and this one from 3 months ago, and so on and so forth. I don't really want to do that if I can avoid it. There may be more connected stream series for like Daggerheart or more general TTRPG stuff in the future, aside from like sharing Spotlight, which is a series of standalone kinds of things, right? Because you don't have to have watched one to watch the other. But that's all just context. When I am GMing in a game where I either know that the group is interested in doing a lot of collaborative world building, or I am pitching it and then trying to explain how I would approach GMing in a game where there's a lot of collaborative world building, I'm going to talk about a few things, right? I'm going to be thinking about the GM as a facilitator and an instigator. I'm going to be thinking about the GM as a showrunner or story editor. And what I mean by those is I approach my role during session 0, especially when we're talking about world building, as somebody who is keeping the conversation rolling, getting the conversation rolling, trying to poke at things that I think are promising and where the group could go farther. I am asking questions that follow up on what someone has done in terms of introducing some element or talking about something that they want in the setting, right? Can you say more about that? Or can you clarify what you mean by that? Or that's really interesting to me. I'd love to dig into that a bit more. GM as instigator would be like asking specific questions like, why do we think the gods abandoned this world? Or what is it about that excessive use of the gods' power that caused this region to become kind of magically polluted, right? I will be trying to throw interesting, provocative prompts at the players in a pretty similar way to the way I would in a given session, but for session 0 and world building, I can operate and I can ask questions at a much bigger scale, right? Because we're talking about the setting writ large during a session 0 world building kind of activity, versus if I ask a really big world scale question during session 4, that might be a little bit trickier. Folks are maybe more thinking about a narrowed in individual or group scale, and that it's a little bit of a whiplash to come all the way back out to the world scale. Or if I'm asking something that's that big, there's the question of whether this is something that should have been established earlier. When you're playing games that for me are like in the Powered by the Apocalypse tradition, where play to find out or draw maps and leave blank spaces, right? Either or both of those are principles, then I'm more likely to have some big things left undefined in the world building, even a few sessions in, because we are creating enough of the world to get the ball rolling, to give characters context and cultures some texture, but we're not necessarily establishing and detailing everything. In the map of Bastion that I made for the Bastion of Hope campaign frame, all that is detailed is one continent. And it's not a tiny continent, but it's certainly not most of the world. I wanted to create at least this first campaign frame with a small enough scale that Bastion didn't feel like it was so tiny that it doesn't matter in the broader scheme of things, right? This is a region with Bastion and then 5 other major factions. So 6 major factions in some ways is a lot, but if we're thinking about a whole world, 6 factions is not that many. Yeah, right. It's fun to get to find out when you're a GM because of things that the players have done or ways that they surprise you in their interpretations of things, right? They can surprise a GM through how they act as the character, but also how they add to the world as a co-creator, as a co-storyteller. And if you feel the need to fill in a lot of the gaps, there then is necessarily less room for somebody to throw out an idea that completely reinterprets how you think about the way that the world is by filling in one of those gaps. Not to say that it can't be done, but for this stream, right, we're going to think about adding to the world, building the world together, but not necessarily feeling like we have to do everything ahead of time. Something that I want to talk about now before we go to the map is that if you are using either one of the maps from the Daggerheart core book, right, there's 3 blank maps with pick lists, and then there's the 6 maps that go with the 6 different campaign frames that also then have those pick lists. If you've got a map that is already giving you the tools for, like, here's a bunch of names of places that you can add on, and the map is built in that way, you already have some tools. But you could go to Watabo on itch.io and just create a region. I'm trying to find Perilous Shores by Watabo. Watabo is a creator who makes a bunch of different proc-gen tools, and I have used Perilous Shores before. Now it's not loading for me for some reason. I will try to remember to put a link to that into the description on YouTube. The map that you bring to the table will make some decisions, or will have made some decisions for you ahead of time, right? Anything that is written on the map in terms of place names is something you either need to accept or you need to reject and replace, or just reject. Okay, here's Perilous Shores. That is watabo.itch.io/perilous-shores. And Watabo is spelled Watabou. Notahag says, wow, that's so interesting. My players prefer to use Session 0 world building for relaxing and joke content, like silly city names. I wonder what would happen if I asked them about gods. Maybe it would spook them, but maybe they will see the world and the game in a different way. Every table is going to have their own preferences about what they want to cover. If the campaign you're going for is silly city names and everything is kind of wacky, then setting yourself up with wacky in shared world building sounds great. If you're hoping for kind of dramatic heroic fantasy and shared world building is silly joke stuff, that may not be as much in alignment. And if everybody is bought in on a tone that the shared world building is not supporting, then that may be something to reevaluate. I don't know how your table operates, and so I'm not going to say that what y'all are doing is automatically not serving your goals. And Pathfinder PhD says, from my perspective, it helps draw the players into the game. They have contributed to the story, giving them agency. Absolutely. This is a big part of it for me. That when I make a world with players, they begin session 1 already feeling some sense of ownership of the setting, right? They leave the world building part of session 0 already feeling some ownership. They will have made part of the world that they can then draw on in creating their own player characters, or elements that they could tap into for the characters' backstories, for the characters' connections. They have more context of the setting from having engaged with it more directly, versus, and a lot of campaigns work like this and they go pretty well, right? We're going to play in Eberron. And so here's like here's 30 pages from one of the Eberron books in PDF that folks should read to give you the background. And if you just stick to that, folks will have had to kind of do homework. But if you do the work, if it's classwork instead, to extend this metaphor, right? If we all come together and we build the setting together, that may connect more intensely for some folks than just reading somebody else's writing about a place, anticipating that they're just going to engage with that place on that writing's terms. Different groups will want different things, right? You might play a game in Eberron where the GM has like printed out a map of Eberron and they're like, okay, well, there's some names that are already here, but let's take a lot of liberty in changing stuff, right? We can change names, we can change some of the history, we can add places, you know, maybe that's a way that a group that already knows Eberron but wants to play in Eberron again and make it feel fresh. Maybe that's the way that you approach that. If you've got a map and you don't have a pick list, then you're going to need to bring a little bit more to the table, right? Because when you're passing the map around, if we're using the technique that is listed and described in the Daggerheart core book, which I really like, somewhat informed or inspired by something like Avery Alder's The Quiet Year game. And there are a number of games that do things like this. If we don't have the names ahead of time, then when I pass it to another player, they're being asked to do kind of two big creative things. Come up with a name and some information about what that name means, right? What is this place? What is this thing that you're describing? If you have a pick list, the names can be inspirational on their own. So you could look at a list and be like, oh, what does it mean for something to be the Stolen Fen, right? I think that's one of the items on the pick list for the Witherwild. Right, so that can be inspiration. So one thing you might do if you want to really stretch it out and separate the sections to make each of them less intimidating is before session 0 or early in session 0, ask everybody to write 3 cool fantasy sounding place names on like an index card or something, right? And then they hand them all to you and you build the pick list. Or maybe people do that ahead of time. Right, you can separate out these steps a little bit more if you want to. The last thing I would say before getting to bringing the map out, and this is just one way of doing it, maybe your group wants to start with a map and then see what emerges. Something you might do to try to make sure that folks are on the same page from the beginning, and this is a little bit inspired by Not a Hag's suggestion, though I'm not suggesting here that this is how that table works. If we pull out the map and start doing shared world building, and I think we're going to do kind of like a beer and pretzels adventure fantasy game inspired by something like Skull Kickers or the Adventure Zone Balance, and then another player is thinking that we're going to do something that is like much more intense and dramatic and like intimately interpersonal, the world building we do may not mesh as well, though a lot of settings can be made in such a way that you can tell a bunch of stories in different tones and subgenres within that setting. But if we're trying to control scope and create material for world building that is maximally usable and serves as touchstones for everybody in the game, you might want to get on the same page ahead of time in terms of what is the tone of this game, right? Is this more wacky? Is it more serious? Is it is it like kind of dark fantasy oriented? Are we going to dwell on long-term injuries? Are we going to talk about like the human cost of war? Or are we doing something that is, has a lighter touch, right? Where we're, the themes we're looking to explore are like the power of friendship and found family and the way that kind of learning about one another leads to understanding and that fights hate. Some of those you can take in different tonal directions, but if you have a discussion about tone before you start filling out the map, that may help you avoid situations where something on the map feels really incongruous with where the game ends up going. It's not a guarantee, but it may help. The other thing to think about is what subgenre of fantasy or what type of story do you want to tell, right? Is this heroic fantasy where we are going to travel the world and fight a bunch of different villains? Is this kind of gritty dark fantasy where we have to travel to the different kind of soul fires in the world and reignite them to keep the cloying darkness from swallowing the world, right? If we're doing something that's like Age of Umbra but not quite, inspired by Dark Souls or something. If you get on the same page about tone and subgenre and kind of the aim of the campaign, I think that can help a lot of time. Sometimes maybe you want to look at the map first and then make some of those decisions. And then maybe you're going to need to do a little bit of editing. You go, okay, we ended up with more of a serious tone. Should we go back and rename this mountain that has like a silly joke name? Maybe you don't need to. Maybe you just tweak it a little bit and everybody knows that there's still a joke, but you're not going to kind of break down into laughter every time it's mentioned during the game. The CATS framework that is referenced in the Daggerheart core book can be a really good tool for this, right? What's the concept of the campaign? What is the aim of the campaign? What is I think it's tone, and then subject, concept, aim, tone, subject. It's been a little while since I read all the stuff about CATS. But you can find that in the core book, or you can look it up. Having some bit of structure to help frame and guide your session 0 conversation can be really great, because session 0 can be a bunch of different things. And I have found sometimes that if I'm going to do shared world building and we're going to do character creation together, and we want to talk about safety tools, and we're doing CATS all together, I might want more than like 1 3-hour session to do all of that work. Right? I might need session 0 and session 0.5. Or if you have longer play sessions, maybe that's not a problem. Or maybe you do some of the agreements about like CATS and things ahead of time via email or on your Discord or whatever. And then when you get to the table, everybody has some sense of what to expect from the game. And then you build the setting together, build your characters, and you get going. Not a Hag asks, can the character and archetype of these villains be part of the shared world building during session 1? Or is it too much work for players during session 0? I think if people wanted to create villains in session 0, you absolutely can. In the first Daggerheart playtest game that I ran for my Wednesday night group of friends, we definitely detailed at least one major villain during the shared world building that we did. Right? It was somebody who had conquered an area. And so in describing that area, we necessarily were detailing this character who was the kind of big bad in charge of this region or this kingdom that he had conquered. I think some combination of interesting places, important NPCs, a sense of the like factions and different major players of the region you're going to be playing in, those all seem like useful things to decide during a session 0 world building kind of effort. But also, if you're playing Daggerheart specifically, the class-based background questions will also end up generating some NPCs, some factions, and some locations. Or if you've done shared world building with the map or some other system, a game system or process, those background questions might then refer back to material you have developed together because you already have something to start from. What parts or what elements of world building your table is interested in doing are probably going to vary based on the interests of the people, right? Some people think more in terms of places. Some people think more in terms of characters. Some people want to talk about what the gods in this world are like. And so there's a little bit of like sounding out what people are interested in. And if you already know your table, maybe you have a sense of where people's interest lies, and you can either then lean into that and do a lot of world building that's focused on factions and NPCs and villains, and then you fill out some other stuff later, or you find a world building tool that helps you maximize what your table is already inclined to do and really spotlight it, or to complement what your table is inclined toward. So if you go, okay, I know that my group is going to want to come up with factions and villains. What if we play a game that talks about places, right? So we're going to have a focus on places, which will naturally provide context for factions and villains, right? Maybe that works better for you. So I think that's enough setup. Now we are going to go, boom, wrong direction, to the Bastion of Hope map. This is a map I made myself using the Incarnate tool, like program. I'm not a great map maker. I would love to, at some point, allot the budget to commission somebody else to make a better map. This is the one that I have right now, so we're going to play with it. Not a hag. Give a replayer their own question. If you can do that either in the moment or write down questions ahead of time to kind of like, not softball, but play exactly into what you know these players' interests are. Right? It's like, okay, I know that Susan loves thinking about faction conflict. Can I write a prompt or a question that sets Susan up to be able to detail and describe some factions and their conflicts during this process? And then, right, then you're able to like distribute the responsibility. Okay, this person's going to talk about factions and this person's going to talk about like fantastical geography, and you don't need to get that codified, but that may be one way of helping organize your own thoughts when you're GMing or prepping to GM a session 0 like that, to try to make sure to cover the bases. And nothing says you can't continue doing large-scale world building later on, whether that is between sessions or just explicitly taking some time during a play session. Say, hey, since we're in a new region and we didn't detail a lot here, I'd love to spend like a half an hour just building out this region a little bit more so that we have a stronger sense of it. And then we're going to be able to draw on that in the next story arc when we're here. You might also need to do more shared world building if a new character or a new player joins the group, right? My Tuesday group playing the Witherwild is going to have a new player and a new character this next week. So I'm going to want to spend some time figuring out how that character can connect to the other player characters and make space for that new player to add a little bit or to kind of have a bit of sense of an ownership on this setting that the group is all built together, right? This person is joining the group, and so they become part of the people who are getting to decide what this setting is about and what it is like. So here in this Bastion of Hope map, right, we have the 6 major areas. We've got Bastion, which is where the player characters are from / what they're fighting for. This is this one free nation that has overthrown its overlord. Bastion of Hope, if you're not familiar, is a setting where dragons and necromancers have taken over basically the whole world and carved it up into their own territories. And then Bastion is a newly free nation whose people overthrew their dragon thanks to some divine assistance. I won't go too much more into it now because that's not the emphasis here. The 5 other regions are 5 roads, the laboratory, the Marrow Plains, the necropoli, right? Not one necropolis, several necropoli, and Velsivar. Velsivar here is a pretty big territory. You can see through the dotted line. It's got this mountain range that splits in a Y, but then also there's some other arable land that's out here. The necropoli kind of covers this southwest territory. There's one big city. There's a fortress over here. The Marrow Plains is pretty spare, but there's a town all the way over here called Dead End because it's at the end of this road system. And there's another settlement over here and one here. And there's something called Fort Vigilance, which is in the Marrow Plains territory. And then 5 Roads has kind of a big, long central road that goes to this settlement that is actually really centrally located and is in a position to be able to do trade and communication with a bunch of different places, right? These roads lead to Bastion, the Marrow Plains, the laboratory, and then at a distance all the way over to Velsivar. 5 Roads is a nation of trade and communication because they have this kind of central hub settlement that they're able to utilize in how they engage with the other territories. So if we are going to play a Bastion of Hope campaign and using the campaign frame, right, I take this map, I lay it out in front of the table, and for this exercise, we are all going to be the table. And I have made a pick list, right? This pick list over here, I will read out the items on this list. Inkblot, the Basking Stone, False Hoard, Fangbreaker Cave, the Boneyard, Expedience, Fallowmire, the Dead Grove, Burned Twin, Hope's End, Last Light, Little Hoard, Old Perch, Ashen Vale, The Cold Vein, Chore's Horn, Westron, South Cenotaph, Shattered Spire, and Doom Valley, right? For these, I'm trying to be evocative. I'm trying to gesture toward the types of place names that might be common in a setting that's dominated by dragons and necromancers. I need to re-export this map because I was very silly and used the wrong word horde, right? These hordes, at least one of them should probably be H-O-A-R-D, a dragon's horde, not H-O-R-D-E, like a horde of enemies. To give an example, I will take the first turn here and explain what a turn is like. And then what I would love for folks that are watching live is pick one of the names or phrases from this pick list and then be ready to kind of submit it and then talk a little about what you think that should be in this version of the Bastion of Hope setting that we are building together. And again, I will provide an example. I am going to say that I'm going to pick Fallowmire. And here I'm going to take a large line, right? So I'm going to cross out Fallowmire. Then I'm going to put it ideally you've got text and color and it'll match your map more, or you've got a map printed out and you're writing on it. Ideally, you're probably not using paint like I am here, but we use what we've got. So Fallowmire is going to be the name of this settlement, and it is called Fallowmire because the arable land around this settlement has been left fallow for generations because it was so stripped of nutrients by over-extraction and then by conflict with this neighboring region, this neighboring nation. The laboratory run by one of the dragons, and Marrow Plains is owned by / ruled by one of the necromancers, right? And so a town where there is no arable land around it, what do they end up doing? Right? They must need something else for all the peasants to do in order to support the ruler, right? They are going to be made to do something that benefits the nation. So either they are growing stuff not in the soil, they are doing something to regenerate the soil, right? So they are planting, they're like planting crops that are in some way supporting or feeding this soil to make it no longer need to be fallow. Or we could be really gross and fantastical and say living things don't grow here, unliving things grow here. And this is going to be a quick content warning for some like horror gross stuff, right? They plant people. They take people who are no longer useful. And then once they're dead, the dead are planted to grow into like flesh trees or flesh constructs or something. And so it's Fallowmire, even though they grow things here, because nothing living grows in Fallowmire. Right here, I'm trying to think about the name and draw upon it while building a new element that adds to and rounds out what is already in the setting. Right? Fallowmire is an example of how gross and scary the regions that are ruled by the necromancers are. The land is stripped of its ability to support life, and so they develop unlife in this place, right? They plant people, they feed them blood. It could be as gross in like Castlevania, Dark Soulsy as you want. That's going to be something like a tone agreement, right? For this case, I'm going to go a little bit that direction because it seemed cool and scary. And we're in September, which for many people is part of the Halloween season. I would rather Halloween get 2 months than some other holidays, right? Halloween has a lot to speak for it. And Halloween has to fight hard to prevent the inevitable march of Christmas from taking over half of the year in terms of like retail decorations and stuff like that. This is just a joke. So what did I do? I picked one of the names or phrases off of the pick list. I found a place where I thought it would make sense to go as I was developing my idea about what this place is, right? I started with Fallowmire. Okay, some place is Fallowmire. What does Fallowmire mean? Why is this place Fallowmire? And I talked my way through what this should involve, right? You heard me talk my way through this. Ultimately, in a pass around the map and build a setting game, the minimum of what I think you want to ask for is pick a name from the list or your own, put it on the map, and give the group at least like 2 to 3 sentences of what is this and how does it fit the broader world. And so if I were going to summarize the Fallowmire entry, Fallowmire is a settlement built on land that cannot support growing life due to a history of overexploitation and war. That's sentence 1. Sentence 2 is, instead, the corpses of mortals are planted and fed with blood to grow into undead constructs. That's Fallowmire. With that said, I'd love to go for another 15 to 30 minutes with some suggestions from y'all in chat. So if you're here and you are interested in giving a contribution, I would love to hear an idea that you want to add to this setting using either something from this pick list or an idea that you have. If you are not as familiar with Bastion of Hope and you have questions about the setting, absolutely throw those in, and I will try to give as much context as I can so that it's easier for you to add something in. Okay, I've got a contribution from Pathfinder PhD. The Boneyard, located in top of the Y-shaped mountains, right? So probably somewhere around here. A battle against dark forces occurred here that led to much death. Bones litter the ground and occasionally rise up against the living. And this is interesting because this is lingering necromantic forces or necromantic power in the region controlled by a dragon. That makes it even more interesting to me because normally I might expect something like the Boneyard over in the Necropoli or Marrow Plains. That it persists in the territory of Velsivar, that's interesting to me. So we're going to take the Boneyard off the list, right? I cross it off so that we don't end up using it twice. And then I say the Boneyard. And here I'm going to try to grab this. Well, it's going to have to live there. I should have used Affinity Designer instead of Paint here because it's easier to manipulate things. So for ER Justin, the Pathfinder PhD's bit here is a great example of what a contribution can be, right? It doesn't have to be especially long. The boneyard, which we have now placed, is in the top of the Y-shaped mountains. This may not be exactly where Pathfinder PhD imagined. If it's not, please let me know. A battle against dark forces here, right? So that is probably dragon forces against necromancer forces. And a lot of people died. Bones litter the ground and occasionally rise up against the living. So there is some kind of permanent necromantic residue in this area that occasionally manifests kind of a group plume outbreak of undead, whether that is skeletons, zombies, or something like that, who go and attack the living. If I were going to build on that, I would probably ask, and go ahead and answer this if you like Pathfinder PhD, or we can just use it as an example of where I might follow up. What do you think is what does the settlement closest to Boneyard do? How do they handle these occasional uprisings, right? Do they post guards? Is it like a once in a generation thing? And so there's like a timer within the community where they know that something is coming? How do we think we can connect what's happening in the Boneyard to something else, somewhere else in the region? Claw Hill looks like it might be a good candidate here, right? This little settlement over there, if the Boneyard is here, maybe Claw Hill is the closest, or maybe it's some settlement that's in the mountains. Perhaps it aligns with a celestial event. Oh, okay, well now we're tying into the stars and fate and things like that, and that is really interesting. Okay, so Not a Hag says, Inkblot is literally the name of my cat, so may I take it? You absolutely can. It's a dark lake turned completely black, the result of a necromancer's experiment. The dark water serves as a portal to a shadowy dimension. Monsters come out of the lake and terrorize the people, but ordinary people trying to escape their enemies sometimes go into the water as a last resort. Who knows what happens to them? I love including like a GM or player prompt in this Not a Hag, so that is very fun. So it's near the laboratory, right? So we could say, first I'm going to cross off Inkblot. Boom, we've got that one done, right? And so it could be this lake over here in 5 roads, or we could just say that we're going to add a lake, right? I can change my color to blue, and then I can, let's see, if I had a shape, right? Freeform selection. Okay, cool. That's a lake. And so now we're going to fill it. Nope. It didn't stick. So I'm just going to draw. Right? But this lake should be ink black, shouldn't it? Right? And so I'm going to do this. Boom. So that's the ink blot. And now we add the name, right? The text here is probably bigger than what I would want, but we do that. Reviewing the write-up on Inkblot, right? Is there some kind of follow-up that I want to do? I might think, okay, the Inkblot is in the laboratory's territory. I might ask, what experiments do you think Velfrazek, the overlord of the laboratory, has been conducting in the Inkblot? And I might say we could present this as rumor, or we could establish the reality of what is happening. When you're doing this world building, right, you can operate on different levels. You can say, what are some rumors about this? Or what do people say about this? Or what is really happening here? You can shift up and down in terms of levels of certainty, where if you all are co-authors, you can stay on that level of certainty. We are making how the world really is. But you can also kind of dive into the fiction and the experience of the world, the experience of the characters in the world. What do people say is the reason for this? Right? Is the Inkblot due to the magic of the Marrow Queen, or does it predate her? What experiments or expeditions has Frazek sent into the ink blot? What do people say they have seen in the ink blot, right? I, as the GM, could ask these questions like they are world building prompts that we could use in a session of Daggerheart, or I could try to be a little bit more broad and try to tease something out and ask, like, I think there's some rumors about the ink blot. What makes sense to be rumors that people spread about this place, right? It's a much more open prompt, but I'm still asking for more contribution. I'm trying to do some follow-up to build on what is there. If you're not doing any follow-up or interconnection, you can end up with a map with a bunch of different interesting things, but not take the time there in that process to think about how everything fits together. Especially if some stuff is already set on the map, I think it makes sense to spend some time to think about how stuff fits together, because the ink blot is near something. It's in somebody's territory. What are they going to do about it? This is a weird, scary magic thing that leads to a shadow dimension. Okay, if you're a terrible exploitative lightning dragon, Frazek, who runs the laboratory, what are you going to do with access to a shadow dimension? Right? And that way we are taking time and putting the work in to make sure that the world feels like it is interconnected and not just a scatter shot of interesting little places that don't really seem to have any relationship to each other. Sometimes you might want a weird, fantastical map where strange stuff is right up next to each other and it doesn't necessarily make sense because that's your goal, right? If you're playing something like Forbidden Lands, or if you're playing like a hex crawl game where you want that incongruity, that's great, right? Something like Ultraviolet Grasslands and the Black City might do that. Forbidden Lands might do that. Tons of different options. But something else like the Electrum Archive does talk a lot about kind of the context of things in regions and how they connect to one another. So there's different approaches. Okay, so that is the Boneyard, Fallowmire, and the ink blot. If anybody else who is watching live feels like adding something in, I would love to go first to somebody who hasn't added something. And if you have already added something, so that's Not a Hag and Pathfinder PhD, if you've got another idea, get that on deck. Great. Capitaran says, Burned Twin, a mountain in the south range of the Y, so it's down here somewhere. Highly magical, technological society used geothermal energy to power their society, long defunct and calling to adventurers to loot it. That is very interesting, right? Because that, to me, I would interpret as this is a society or, a nation state or something that existed before the dragons took over and either fell because of the dragon takeover or fell sometime before it. And this is one of the many secrets and mysteries of the world that have been covered up or hidden by the propaganda and the long rule of these overlords, right? That's how I'd probably pitch it. But if we're figuring things out at the table together, right, I'm going to say, oh, is that like this? Or I would think about this as this, right? As the GM, I'm trying to contextualize it, but I want to leave room for the person who introduced it, in this case, Captaran, to say, oh, I was thinking about it more in this way. And then we kind of go back and forth until everybody feels like we're on the same page. So first, right, I'm going to cross off Burned Twin. And then we're going to go down here. And I am going to make this a little bit smaller. All right, so I need the text to be smaller. Just a little bit. And then I'm going to make this be a bit smaller. So that way this is tricky because the contrast is not very good. This is not a map I'm going to hang up on my wall and be proud of because it's really clear. This is a map that is awesome because we are doing it together, even though we have some limited tools because none of us are in the same place and we are using paint. If I do this again, I will definitely try to use a better tool. But I'm hoping that this is serving as useful examples of how this process works. So if we were going to go around the quote unquote table 3 times where everybody adds 3 things, maybe on a future turn, Keptarin would want to add something that is connected to Burn Twin, or go, oh, I really like this thing about the ink blot. I want to add something that kind of connects to it. And that way we are weaving together parts of the world so that everything feels like it exists in its context, and that the world is internally consistent, which can be really handy. But even when we're doing this, we don't have to name every settlement. We don't have to get into a lot of detail about what that society is that lived in Burned Twin, right? We can have the idea that there's a lost civilization and maybe leave it, and then the GM fills it in. Or we don't develop it a lot, but then in this imaginary game, right, I reach out to Keptarin and I say, I'd love to talk more about Burned Twin and what your thoughts about what that civilization might have been like, to give that player who introduced the idea a little bit of ongoing authorship of this element that they introduced. That's how I like to approach it. It's not always going to work for every element, because sometimes I just need to be able to fill things out, and some players may not want to do more than what they've done and the shared world building, right? Like, I like this idea, I put it there, do with it as you see fit. Again, that's going to be something to figure out with the players. I have done this kind of build a map game for Daggerheart a number of times, and a fair amount of the time we do stuff together, and then the GM kind of does more of the work connecting things that weren't already connected and then elaborating on what is there. That is probably going to be the most common within games where there is that shared world building, map building, but then we're still playing a game like Daggerheart or D&D or Fantasy Age, where there is a traditional GM role. Not a Heg says, in Defense of Paint, it helps concentrate on the world building, not on the graphic design of the map and cute icons for the places. That is absolutely true. So I'm definitely not distracted by wanting to make the map look good, and that is liberating. Does anybody have any more questions about this process? Or, and this is open to everybody, another contribution that you would like to make, right? I think we can probably go for another 10-15 minutes if people have questions or more ideas, but I would like to think that this, if we think about it as one time around the table, gives some sense of what you can do. When I have the time, tend to try to go 2 or 3 times around the table so that everybody can add multiple things, and somebody who goes early in a round doesn't feel like, oh, well, those later ideas were better because, folks were warmed up, or somebody who goes early maybe didn't feel as comfortable, but then they get to feeling more comfortable. And then sometimes your first idea is not the one that you're most excited about. So giving folks a chance to go around a few times is really handy. I also encourage other players to be curious about the things that are introduced by players. If I'm a player and not a character, and then I hear about the ink blot that Not a Hag introduced, I might ask Not a Hag questions about the ink blot. And when I'm GMing, I love that. I don't want to shoot down player-to-player curiosity, because especially in this process of the shared world building, we are all in this together, right? The GM might have the most authority or the final say as kind of like the story editor who has to keep everything coherent. But if I express interest in somebody else's idea, hopefully that's validating and exciting for them, because it is going, well, this is really cool. I want to spend more time talking about the thing that Not a Hag came up with. I think for a lot of people that can be like exciting and make you feel proud because people are engaging with something that you created, and you're getting more of that layering and iteration and back and forth of, okay, but what if it's like this, or asking a follow-up question which lets you go deeper on something. If everybody just has their own thing, adds something to the map, writes 2 or 3 sentences, and there's no follow-up, maybe you're not digging as deep on some of these ideas as you might be able to. Or you're missing, in that moment at least, the opportunity to thread more of these things together, right? Like the Inkblot and Fallowmire are not terribly far away from one another. Is there something that we would want to do to reflect that closeness and what that might mean? Either did the Inkblot inform the death that led to Fallowmire being fallow? Are the constructs that are built in Fallowmire responsible for the weird zone of the Inkblot, right? If the Fallowmire is much older and has been kind of throwing undead at the laboratory for a long time, did that then lead to the Inkblot? And that gives us some sense of like relative history and helps us build a timeline if we want one. And again, this shared world building does not have to stop when session 0 stops. It doesn't even have to stop, or it certainly doesn't have to stop when you kind of say, okay, cool, let's step away from the map and make characters. Because you might make characters and then realize that you want to add things to the map for those characters or based on those characters. Or the way that the characters are described might lead you to have new questions or new ideas about things to add to the map. Oh, well, I want my character to come from like a city that's all in the trees, and we didn't have one, so I want to add it. My character is from here, right? And we go, oh, okay, well, this is right, the town of Canopy. And then we go, okay, well, this is we now know where Canopy is, and we're going to put it on the map so that we don't forget that this settlement is in this particular place. And we know that Canopy is not too far from Fort Vigilant, and it's maybe the closest settlement and bastion to Burned Twin. So that's interesting. Do we then have some rumors about Burned Twin persisting in folklore that's kind of told to people growing up in Canopy, right? We're thinking about how to connect these different elements so that the history of the world and the feeling of being in it has some sense of reality, some sense of verisimilitude, even though we all know that it is a story and that we are adding to this world as we go. The fun thing about that is that you can do stuff that if this were a novel that somebody was reading after the fact would seem brilliant, because you can do your own foreshadowing slash after shadowing. You can reinterpret things, you can add things based on what is already established. But then once the thing has been added and you have the relationship between them that you're establishing by adding this thing and then talking about it, you can go, oh, that makes so much sense, that's great. Because the world is living, right? It is continually being added to and evolving, and the story of the game exists afterward in your own memory, right? In the memory of the individual players. And so there are some narrative tricks where you can play where in some situations, if I wrote a book about Bastion of Hope and then 2 books later introduced the town of Canopy and then reinterpreted some stuff, I would need to do that in a particular way to avoid some folks, some readers, feeling like I was just retconning something or shoehorning something in, or being a little cheap writing wise. But if I established Canopy and then introduced Burned Twin later, well, Burned Twin was secret. Did I thread in some little bit of foreshadowing and canopy that I could pull out to gesture toward Burn Twin. In a book series, that would probably be the more broadly appreciated way of doing it. But if we're playing in a TTRPG together and we're all just telling a story to satisfy one another, coming up with something that recontextualizes what is already there, for me, is really exciting. And as long as everybody at the table is bought into it, it can be a fun way to make sure that that world building process doesn't stop once you pick up your character sheets. Doesn't stop once you're into, okay, we took a long rest last session and this long-term countdown is at 5, right? If we leave blank spaces, we can fill those blank spaces and be surprised by what is there. If we think about book series and comic series and films and so on and so forth, there are a number of series where as things go on, the action moves or other things happen to reveal some big element that wasn't in play earlier, but then recontextualizes or sheds new light on what has come before. And that's just storytelling. When you are all playing a game together, whether that's Daggerheart or something else, you can use those tools and tricks as well. You don't have to report to anybody, right? I'm not gonna like hack into your Zoom call and be like, oh, that was a little hackneyed of you to add the ink blot after talking about the way that things work in Falomire, right? Like, absolutely not. You're only playing to satisfy one another. If you're doing an actual play, maybe that's a little bit different, but maybe it doesn't matter. How do you want to do this? Sorry, that was an unintentional Critical Role bit. What is fun about the game for you? What in role-playing games do you like? What about shared world building is interesting to you? And how much do you want to carry that forward into everyday session play? Some groups might want to, we're going to make this setting, and then we're going to set aside the idea that we are all co-authors of the setting. And we're going to move on and we're going to tell a story in that setting. We have made it. Maybe that's what your group likes. I love being able to keep adding to a setting and filling things out, or being able to reinterpret things and go, oh, well, see, because this thing that we just made up, maybe that means that, and then I talk about some new interpretation of what has already come. Or the game that I'm playing with myself is I'm trying to think about what is already in the setting and where I can expand it into one of those gaps to fill out and help round out the setting. Pardon me. So that is me waxing poetic about shared world building in session 0 for a while. I am going to... Okay, I already posted that thing. This is probably going to be the only stream this week. I may do another sharing spotlight later in the month, but because of the things that are happening this week and have happened this week, I've got a lot on my plate. So we'll see how things go. I am going to want to share an update about some Bastion of Hope stuff pretty soon because things have been developing, plotty fingers. It's been very fun to work with the folks that I have contributing art and layout and the support in editing that I got, but there's going to be more on that a little bit later. Thank you so much to Notahag and Kapataran and Pathfinder PhD and Ira Justin and everybody else who was chatting and pitching things to add to this example of shared world building. I was hoping that there'd be enough folks who were excited to engage that we would get to have the example more like what I wanted, which was what we ended up getting. So thank you all for being here and for your contributions. If you are watching this on YouTube and you have an idea for something you would want to add to this map, absolutely add it in a comment, right? We'll get to have this version of the Bastion setting that can continue to be added to, and then those comments can be ways for people to think about and broaden their ideas about shared world building in this kind of a process. So with all that said, I am going to wrap up and go to my ending. Thanks for hanging out with me, and thanks to everybody who is watching later on. I will see you next time. Bye.